So welcome again to our wonderful series with Anna Urowitz Freudenstein. I'm going to get it yet. And I was just explaining that Carol is away today, so I'm it. And we are excited to talk about today's topic. The whole series is about time. Today we're going to be talking more specifically, I think, about the calendar and the moon. Right? Does that sound like a right title? We'll be playing with the title. So we're going to let you get started. And as usual, if you have any questions, please put them in the chat, and we will have a break halfway through. We'll answer all the questions. And then afterwards, at the very end, we can have some time to just schmooze if people like. All right. So over to Anna.
Thank you, Randy, as usual. So happy to see such a terrific crew here today. I reflected on what I taught last week, as I do always. I try to when I teach. And I recognize that it probably was a very different class for many of you. If you were with us last year, we did a lot. We did history pretty much. And then I kind of snuck in the whole class of history at the beginning of this session. And then kaboom, I hit you over the head with a non-history class, which is what was the intention was. We were here to study Talmud texts and other rabbinic texts together. So the feel of it might have been very different. So actually, I mean, and it's a little bit more technical sometimes. So I guess because of the size of our group, we really do need to wait to the midway point and then towards the end to take questions. But I really hope that people don't hesitate to ask questions at those times, even if you have to jot something down for yourself to remember until then. Because even though, of course, there's no exam and there's no test, and you don't have to know every single thing that I said or even understand everything. My goal, of course, is to, I guess try to impart my love and excitement for these topics to you, which hopefully means understanding and as deep as you want it to be. So with that in mind, as I said, because things are different than they were before, please, please, please feel free to ask questions and don't be at all embarrassed or anything to do so. Okay. So I just wanted to make sure that I introduced today's topic with that. Today's topic, depending on your own personal knowledge and background in Judaism, like is true for many of our things that we're studying here together, might have some vague understanding in your mind. These things might sound familiar to you. If so, that's great. The idea is, though, that we're trying to ground them as much as we can in text so that we can get a taste of the text, really all the different forms of rabbinic text. Today we're going to see some commentary, we're going to see some midrash, we're going to see some Talmud, so that we can understand where all these very important ideas in Judaism came from. Because after all, it's not a mistake that Judaism is called, we are called the people of the book, right? So we tend to think of the book as being the Bible, and it absolutely is, except for, as I pointed out in the first class of our sessions here together on time, for Judaism, the way it evolved post-biblically, which we all are living in a post-biblical Jewish world, the book was not only what was written down in the Bible, but rather what was also transmitted originally orally, and then eventually written down. So those books of rabbinic literature or Talmudic texts, or however you want to refer to it, or oral Torah, sometimes it's still called oral Torah, even though it's now written for us, it's not oral anymore. But the idea is we need to understand, don't need to, but it enhances, I believe, our understanding of Judaism if we understand the text where all these ideas came from. Okay, so that's really my goal, overall goal for what we're doing here together, and I hope that you'll see that demonstrated today. So today we're talking about time still. We talked about counting days pretty much last time by counting when about darkness and light in terms of when a day begins and when a day ends. And we talked about the creation of light and when that first started during the creation story. Today, we're going to talk about a different kind of counting of time. And as we saw in the title, it has to do with the months. All right, there's my intro. Let's go over to the slides. Okay, so I think I maybe changed the title. I think there was probably another official title to today's class, but I'm calling it the Jewish calendar. Pretty much, you'll see it equals out. It's all the same. All right, so the Jewish calendar, again, this is the slide we saw last time. We are not studying philosophy, even though there's philosophers up on the screen. But I wanted us to remember that there's a philosophical notion behind the concept of time in terms of what is time, not to mention what do we do with that time, right? I mentioned that a little bit at the end of last class in terms of Shabbat and how we sanctify time. We're going to talk about a different kind of sanctification of time today, eventually, namely the counting and establishing of the months and the Jewish calendar, which is considered a mitzvah in Judaism. And we'll see how all that comes to be. So time is something that, doesn't really exist without human beings. I don't think animals care about time. I mean, they care about, when they're hungry or when they want to sleep, but I don't think that they care, that they, have a clock necessarily or anything like a clock. So human beings, though, we talked about counting time last time about dependent on whether there's light around or not light around. Again, remembering this is all before the invention of electricity. For us nowadays, even with us still getting used to daylight savings time, we are not as dependent, of course, on the sun or a full moon, for instance, to give us light because we have electricity. Okay, so we have to really try to put ourselves back in the mindset of a pre-electric age and how key and important light would be for the telling of time. So we talked about the sun last time and that kind of light, and we not conveniently, but we didn't talk about a different way of counting time, and that is by a cycle that occurs in nature, namely the cycle of the moon, the phases of the moon. Okay, so I'm admitting to you today, today is a class in Talmud, but it's also going to be a class in science and a class in math. Okay, so if you're not a math and science person, don't freak out. I'm going to explain it all to you. If you are a math and science person, there's a chance you know more about this than I do. So please forgive me if I'm not, I don't think I'm going to make any mistakes, but there's a chance I might not be as precise as some scientists and mathematicians would be otherwise. Okay, somebody's waiting in the waiting room, guys. Please let her in. Okay, so phases of the moon. Beautiful. I guess, I don't know how whoever made this photograph, beautifully done though. And we see from the new moon, waxing, waning, and the full moon and all the official names. Okay, that's the sciencey part. We don't have to get to that. We will talk more about the moon. We have to, because we're going to see how that is connected to the idea of the month. Before we get there, we are going to start with a biblical verse. Or verses, excuse me. And I just have to point out in terms of the calendar, when I originally picked this topic, I don't know, months ago, I guess, when I talked to Anna and Randy and Carol about it, we didn't have all the dates fixed on the calendar as to what classes would be what day. And I have to say, though, I couldn't have planned it better in terms of this is actually, as they say, beshared, or it's like it's meant to be, because this is exactly the maftir, the additional reading that is done this coming Shabbat. These few verses, well, a few more than these. It starts off here at the beginning of chapter 12 in Exodus, because it is the beginning of preparations of Pesach. Okay, everyone knows it's coming around the corner. And do you think it's hard nowadays to prepare for Pesach? Certainly, we are, I would say, blessed in that we don't have to do that extra job that they had to in ancient times, namely to pick a lamb to prepare and then slaughter as the Paschal sacrifice. But nevertheless, we still read about that in the parsha, in the maftir for this special coming Shabbat. It is called Shabbat HaChodesh, the Shabbat of the month, because it is the beginnings of the month of Nisan, the month of Pesach, and there's a whole lot of preparation that needs to be done in advance of Pesach, and really have to start thinking about it even, at the beginning of the month. So we'll see that in a minute. So actually, you see on the screen in front of you, there's 3 different verses. The last one I really just included because I wanted to remind you of that context about the beginnings of the preparation of the sacrifice of the Paschal lamb. That being said, we are leaving that aside for today and instead going to talk about the first 2 verses that are here on the screen. Okay, the first one is just introducing us. God said to Moses and Aaron in the land of Egypt. When are we talking about in the land of Egypt? Well, at this point in our story, the children of Israel had been slaves. Moses had come in as a leader to try to redeem them with the help of God. All of or almost all of the plagues have passed already, and we are now preparing here in chapter 12 to get ready to leave Egypt. Okay, so this is what's called by the rabbis Pesach Mitzrayim, or the Passover, the very first Passover, the one that they experienced in Egypt. So it is also an opportunity for God, actually, as we see here, to teach. That's how the rabbis actually pointed out, to teach Moses and Aaron something very important about what it means to be Jewish, to come together as a nation. Not only will we be celebrating Pesach together, as we see in that 3rd verse, but we will be establishing time together. Time will hold us together. Time will unify us, and time will, okay, I was going to say control us. I think that's true too, but maybe you could say time will guide us. And the way that we tell time in chunks of time in Judaism, or partial chunks of time, is by the month. And this 2nd verse here, this month shall mark for you the beginning of the months. It shall be the first of the months of the year for you. It's talking about Nisan, the month of Pesach. We'll be talking about that month some more. And it is the beginning of the months. Now, I think many people would say, wait a minute, isn't the beginning of the months back on Rosh Hashanah? And the answer for the rabbis is that's a whole different beginning. The rabbis and Judaism have a different idea of different new years or new ways of counting time that start at different time. Sounds a little bit weird until you think about our lives. If you think about it, we have the Jewish New Year on Rosh Hashanah. We have the new school year, like at the beginning, day after Labor Day. We have the new year of counting down at, in Times Square, New Year's Eve. We have the fiscal new year for businesses, for taxes. So there's a lot of different ways of counting time, even that we experience today. But this one here is the biblical statement that talks about counting by the months. Still, I'm not surprised if you are surprised that that's what's going on here. It doesn't really seem explicitly that that's what is being stated. in the verse, we need commentary in order to understand it. We need that oral tradition to teach that to us. And we're going to see it expressed here in a midrash. So it's a different type of rabbinic literature, not the Talmud. We didn't talk about it so much. Some of the midrashim are stories. Some of them are more legal in nature, which, by the way, is true of the Talmud as well. But this particular midrash comes from around the same time as the Mishnah, so it's a very early time period before the time period of the Talmud. And it is giving us a commentary about that verse about the months. And it says, Rabbi Ishmael says, giving us an explanation of what's going on there with that verse with the months. Moses pointed out the new moon to Israel and said to them, thus shall it, the moon, look, and the new month shall be designated thereby for all generations. So really how this is understood to be is this is the beginning of the establishment of the Jewish calendar and how it's based on months and how months are based on the moon. You wouldn't necessarily get that. I'm just going back for a minute. If you looked at this verse standalone, it doesn't, you don't, I don't think it's possible to understand it from the written Torah alone. We need the oral Torah to come in and teach us that this very important time of coming out of Egypt and preparing for the first Pesach ever is also a time when we are starting to, as a nation, count time together, and we are going to do that by the months. All right, so this is the same picture that I showed you before, but before the title was The Phases of the Moon. Now I've renamed it the Jewish month, okay? And I've added numbers in it as well. So if we see from the beginning of the new moon all the way through to the full moon, and then as the moon is disappearing again, and of course this is a line, so it's a little bit deceptive because it really should be a circle, because right after the 30th comes the first again. Oh, sorry, I circled the wrong way. But I thought it was neater and kind of easier to see it as a line. It's to show us the idea of the lunar month. According to Judaism, the month starts at the tiniest sliver of the new moon and goes through the whole cycle of the moon. And so the 15th of the month is always when the moon is at its fullest. When you see that full moon outside, you can go for a walk, go and walk your dog, then you know it is almost definitely around the 15th of the month of the Hebrew month. So I said almost definitely because this is where the fractions and the math come in, and this is the part where I'm going to give myself permission to, for the most part, to not be as precise. But I'm pointing it out to you here. The lunar month, you know, if you talk to a scientist about, you know, nothing to do with Judaism, but like the full revolution of the full way that the moon turns so that we see it here on Earth and the light, you know, reflecting from the sun onto the moon and all that stuff. That full cycle is actually 29.5 days long. Now, as you can imagine, that's going to lead to some problems because we don't have days that are half days. So in human terms, if we're going to use this natural cycle as a way of counting time, which we're going to in Judaism, we are going to have some months that are 30 days long and some days that are going to be 31 days long. There's going to have to be a little bit of finagling in order for it all to work out on a 12-month cycle, which is a year. And if you thought that was complicated, we're going to get even more complex soon when we bring the sun into the equation. Okay. So once we're talking about the idea about the lunar month, we have to talk about the beginning of that lunar month, why it's special in Judaism. In fact, has a special name, Rosh Chodesh, and why it's special, how it's special, and how we determined it in history. Okay, so we're going to try and see all of that with me. Okay, so the term Rosh Chodesh, which I think many of you have heard before, literal translation of that is the head of the month. Okay, the head is what comes first. So it's the first day of any new month, except for, there's always exceptions in Judaism, when there are two Rosh Chodeshes on a certain month. That's to help us fix up that 0.5 problem we were dealing with before. Someone's waiting to get in from the waiting room, please. So it is the first day of the month, but if a month is 30 days long, then the 30th day of the previous month is treated as part of the Rosh Chodesh for the next month. Okay, so don't get too nervous about that. The only thing that we need to know, unless you're an expert in the calendar, in which case you probably shouldn't be in this class because you know all this already, but there are some times when there are 2 days of Rosh Chodesh. Those of you who have been in synagogue during the week or when Rosh Chodesh happens to be on Shabbat, which actually it does this coming Shabbat, coincidentally again, you will know that sometimes some months it's 2 days and some months it is 1 day. Okay, so thank God we don't have to figure that out on our own anymore. We can all just check our Jewish calendars or our Jewish calendar apps, or wait till the rabbi tells us or the shul bulletin, and then we can understand it from there. Okay, so what it was, Rosh Chodesh for us is not something that we mainly pay attention to in this day and age. Again, if you are praying that day, the daily prayers are different. They're not as long and detailed as the prayers of Shabbat or a holiday, but they're getting close to it. There are extra prayers that are added. And in ancient times, it really was, in the times of the temple, it really was like a semi-holiday. It was announced with the sounding of the shofar. There were special prayers like there is today. There's also a special Torah reading today. Many of you maybe have attended bar or bat mitzvah ceremonies that were conveniently planned not on Shabbat, but on Rosh Chodesh, because you could read Torah on that day. And of course, because of the temple, that there were special extra sacrifices that were added that day. So it's especially important, like any holiday is, but if you take a step back and think about the time before the established calendar like we have now, the deciding of what day was Rosh Chodesh and recognizing that new sliver of that new month and when all these festivities were important, not only because it was important to celebrate on that day, but because it was that day that you started counting the days of the month from. They didn't have calendars. So you would need to know when it was the beginning of Nisan, for instance, in order to start counting to be when it would be Pesach. And it would be important to then communicate that information to all Jews so they'd all know which was the day to celebrate Pesach. And that would be true for any other holiday in any other month as well, with the exception maybe of Rosh Hashanah, which is on the first day of Tishrei. So I suppose the counting would start from the month before. But none of the other holidays are on the first day of the month. So the first day of the month is important to establish in general, but also specifically so that you can then count to see when the holidays start for that given month, and so that you can celebrate the holidays, first of all, appropriately according to Jewish law, but secondly, in a unified manner. The idea of a calendar is so important for unity, to ensure that we are all doing things together. Certainly in ancient times, and it can be argued, in modern times as well. We've talked a little bit about the idea of 1 day versus 2 days for holidays, and not celebrating everything together. We can talk about that in a few minutes. But there were actually different groups of Jews or people who identified as Jews who understood the counting of things on the calendar in different days. Many of you, I think, have heard of the Dead Sea Scrolls, the group of Jews that produced the Dead Sea Scrolls in the desert in the time of the Second Temple. And they understood the counting of the calendar as different from the rest of Judaism, which was part of what caused the schism and breaking off from the rest of the Jews who were more centralized around the temple and how time was established in the temple. So let's see how that time was established. Somebody's waiting to come in the waiting room. Okay, so before we see that, again, the importance about unity, I just wanted to reiterate that because it is believed to be the first mitzvah that was given to the nation of Israel. Okay, so we have in the book of Genesis, we have perhaps the concept of purvu, that we should procreate. We have the idea of brit milah, of a breast. We have the idea of gid hanasheh, that we shouldn't eat from a certain sinew in the thigh of the animal. So those mitzvah were given in the book of Genesis, but they're kind of if you follow them, they're followed at home, kind of privately by the individual, by the family. In terms of the nation as a whole, that this is considered to be the first mitzvah that is given to the nation as a whole. And again, coming out of Egypt, we're just solidifying really as a nation. And part of the idea of Judaism, as it's laid out here in the Torah, is that, and as understood by the rabbis, is that celebrating time, commemorating time, and the holidays and everything else is absolutely essential to do that in a unified, consistent way in order to reinforce the unity and strength of this new nation as it's forming, coming from slavery into freedom. By the way, that was a little Friedvar Torah for you, if you like, for your Seder. Okay, somebody else is waiting to come in. Someone's got to watch the waiting room, guys, and let people in. All right. So again, this is, this is our first piece here that we are going to do from the Talmud. So I think actually I'm going to take the break now. That was a lot of introductory material, but I think we really needed it so that we can delve some more into the rabbinic text that I'm going to be presenting to you next. So it is time for questions. Are there any?
There's a bit of a chat, a little bit of a discussion in the chat.
Oh, okay.
So let me just pull that up. And Lynn Cutler is saying the new moon is actually the one on the right, which is the east, not the one on the left.
Oh God, the science people are better than me. I admit it.
Wait. It gets more fun. It gets more fun.
Oh, good.
And then Bernard Katz says, I don't understand that, Lynn. Surely the new moon is the beginning of the waxing period when the moon gradually becomes fuller until it reaches a full moon. Over to you.
Okay.
So science.
All right.
Scientists in the room?
Yeah. Well, all right. Can you hear me?
Yeah. Yep.
Okay. If you look at the sky when there's a new moon, the crescent shape of the moon looks like a backward C, I'll call it. So that's what we see on your chart. That's what we see on the right-hand side. So that's all I'm saying. When you look at the new moon, the crescent is like a backward C. When you look at the moon that is waning, it looks more at the shape of a C. That's all.
So I'm going to admit, first of all, I admit in the beginning that like the sciencey stuff, not perfect on. But second of all, I just kind of cut and pasted that from someplace on the internet because I really like the picture. And so there is a good chance it was a mirror image of something or the way I cut and pasted
That's okay.
it.
Well, we're reading, it's like reading Hebrew on that.
Oh, well, maybe I intended it as Hebrew.
There you go. There you go. We're reading it like Hebrew.
If anyone wants to know more, I was curious for a quick explanation. Enter New Moon, Farmer's Almanac. They've got a nice short article that explains it.
Okay. Yes, Randy, I think there was some more.
My video on, but I'm having technical problems.
That's okay. It's okay.
Is there somebody else who wants?
I think there was another question just popped up in the chat. A third one.
You're better than me. It's just not coming up for me. Hold on a second.
Okay, 1 second. I can see. When did they get named and how are they chosen? Okay.
No, I don't want that.
The names. So this is Nisan is the first month. So the question is, I would say the original idea is that months are numbered rather than named. The names that exist actually in the Bible are sometimes different than the names as we have them. And the whole concept of 12 as being and again, oh gosh, if there are ancient historians in the room, you might have to correct me also, but the idea of 12 months in a year, as well as some of the biblical names of our months, which aren't necessarily the ones that were used later, have parallels in ancient Babylonian culture. So when I say ancient Babylonian, I don't mean the Babylonia of the Talmud, which is, as we said, around 600 CE. I'm talking about before the Common Era, that the ancient Babylonians had a quite advanced system of time, different than, for instance, the Greeks and the Romans. And as far as I know, a lot of our concepts of clocks, timing, counting things by 60 minutes, 12 months of the year, those kind of things come originally from the ancient Babylonians.
So,
If that
so I
helps.
have a question.
You're on point. You're on point. It's all clear. Yes.
Okay. Yes.
I have a question then. So if the 12 months, etc., came from the ancient Babylonians.
The number 12, yeah.
Right.
Right.
So we have 12 months that are lunar.
Yes.
I know that others have
We're
12
getting
months
to the solar. Don't worry. We're getting there now.
Others have months that are solar, right?
Right.
When was that? We're getting there. Okay.
Right. We're getting there.
I'll
We
wait.
are getting there.
Okay. Anybody
Don't
else?
worry, we're getting the leap years. We're getting the solar. We're getting to the seasons. We're going to do the whole shebang. Okay. Other questions though? Nope.
Don't
All
think
right,
so.
good. Let's go on back to the share screen. Okay, so we are looking at a text here from the Talmud, which starts off with a quote that's from a verse that we have already seen, the same verse that we saw, or two verses here, I guess, or almost two verses, 1.5 verses, that was that same idea about the establishing of the months and how by God pointing out that this is going to be the new month and this is the new moon, etc., that that's the beginning of calendar time and the importance of calendar time in Judaism. The Talmud here adds this idea of this testimony is given over to you. And I will just point out to you is that everything in brackets is part of the commentary to the Talmud. Okay, part of the challenge of Talmudic study is, as I've mentioned before, not only is it written in ancient Babylonian, in a very different style from anything that we are used to. It is also written for an original audience of rabbis who it is assumed certainly knew the whole Bible off by heart, and also knew a good chunk of the oral Torah and traditions off by heart also. So it is very common that it's kind of like written almost in short form. And that's why Talmud study is hard. And Talmud study is almost always done better in groups, in partners with the teacher, because there's always things that to us are gaps. They weren't gaps to the original writers, but to us are perceived as gaps that need to be filled in. So I've added that in for us here in the brackets, and I didn't just write it seamlessly as one sentence because I wanted to be intellectually honest with you. First of all, because I think that's important, but second of all, as a teaching tool to demonstrate to you how difficult the Talmud can be to study. Okay, so the idea is here, this testimony is given over to you. In this case, that means, and others like you. Now, what you are we talking about? We thought we're talking about months here. Really, what we're talking about in this case, we're emphasizing, we're learning something new from these verses, is we're talking about Moses and Aaron. There's not anything, it doesn't mean that Moses and Aaron are the only ones who can, help us tell time by the months, but they are the political and religious leaders of the time of that first generation of nationhood coming out of Egypt together. And it is something that the authorities have to be involved in. Again, imagine If we talked about the importance of unity that would come from the calendar, if everyone just had to figure out time on their own, there's a good chance some of us might see that moon a little bit differently, get based on our eyesight, based on what time of night it was, based on if it was cloudy where you were living or not, based on if you fell asleep and you forgot to look for the new moon. So the idea it is the leadership, the authority, the religious leaders of the community that has the ability of establishing that new moon for us. Just like Moses and Aaron did, so too the other leaders of forthcoming generations. So it's another interesting thing about calendars also is the idea, as I said before, a guide or a control, right? There were times when different rabbis disagreed, even until the early Middle Ages about about time. And was it, when did the new month start or when didn't it? And it led to big fights and schisms within Judaism. So the idea is here that appealing to authority and the correct authorities is, I think, probably not a surprise to you, a pretty important traditional Jewish idea, not only in terms of time, but other things as well. All right. Sorry, next slide. So establishing this new moon, okay? So the idea is we're given this biblical command to do it. We're given an understanding in the Talmud of that biblical command that there are the religious authorities have to be involved with it. And guess what? There's ritual and ceremony and precision involved with it too, as is something, of course, we're familiar with in Judaism. So I'm only giving you like just a little few notes as to what those details were. Again, none of this happens now, but in the time of the temple, you needed 2 kosher, okay? Kosher here means reputable, and there's a whole list of reasons why who could be reputable and who couldn't be. But 2 kosher witnesses had to testify to the high court in the temple called the Sanhedrin.
Oops, Anna seems to have frozen. Anna, you seem to be frozen.
Am I still frozen?
Anna, you're frozen.
No?
No, still. Here's other Anna.
Yeah, maybe we give Anna a couple minutes.
There is another question, but I don't know how to answer it. But I can let you know what the question is. The other question that's up there is whether an eclipse of the moon is mentioned in the Talmud. Anybody know? While we're waiting for Anna, come on.
I think she's trying to get back in.
I know.
Can I throw in another
Okay.
question?
I'm back.
Yeah.
Okay.
Oh.
Am I here again?
Yeah.
Okay. That's the first time that happened. Wow, it's interesting. Anyway, while I'm here, let's do a question.
Jeff, go ahead.
Jeff, go ahead.
Okay, I got confused with the full moon. So, okay, if I go outside and I look up
Yeah.
in the sky
Right.
and it's a full moon,
Yeah.
is that the new month?
No, that's the middle of the month.
Okay.
That's the middle. So, and as a matter of fact, the major holidays, for instance, of Sukkot and Pesach, which start the 14th, 15th of the month, is the night of the full moon, which I'm sure there's some significance to that. I'm not sure exactly what it is. But yeah, full moon is the middle of the month. New moon is the one that's difficult to see because it's just teeny tiny. And that is the one that needs to be searched out in a responsible way. The people who announce that they have found it and come to the temple in Jerusalem with that announcement need to be trusted. Again, this has this idea of unity. There were other Jews or people who were like Jewish adjacent or people that lived in the land of Israel that wanted to mess up the calendar. so that there wouldn't be as much unity. So the rabbis and the people who were in the temple, like kind of proto-rabbis, had to be very, very precise about whose testimony they would accept. And there are stories in the Talmud about actually challenges that they had with that. Okay, so the idea is there's a dual purpose of making sure you have the right time. One is because during that month, there's going to be holidays and there's going to be sacrifices to God in the temple and whatever. And all of those legalities only work if they're on a certain day. Like if you kept Pesach on the week before it was supposed to be Pesach, you wouldn't be keeping Pesach. And so that would be huge and problematic in the temple. So there's that legality, halachic aspect of it. And then there's also the unifying effect of, which I guess is connected, of ensuring that all Jews are keeping time in the same way and are celebrating things on the same day. Okay. So going back to the share screen. Might have to find my space again. No, here we are. Okay, that was weird with my internet. I don't know what happened. Okay, lovely. So the idea is here, the information, once the rabbis and the other leaders in the temple, the priests originally, and then the rabbis established that, yes, this was the correct testimony. That really was that little sliver of almost nothing in the sky is the new moon. Then they'd have to announce it. Now they can't send out a tweet or they can't get on the phone and tell people. So how do you communicate that in ancient times? And here is the description in the Mishnah. I brought it to you here from the Talmud. And it is through fire. Okay, so here, let's see how it goes. Initially, what would they do? They would light torches in the temple. They've said, yes, it's the beginning of the month. How do we communicate that? They would get all kinds of long poles of inflammable things here, tied up with a string, like it's a giant torch, go up to the top of a mountain and light a fire there at the top of the mountain, right? We're dealing with, it's a communication issue here, communication, transportation, tremendously different in ancient times like than today. And so this is the way they came up with it. They could then transmit a message to a far distance quickly. Now, clearly, the people knew approximately when Rosh Chodesh was going to be, so they'd be prepared for this. And once the timing was set, then this procedure was set into motion. So they'd go up to a mountain and they'd have this, I don't know, some kind of a torch or whatever, and wave it back and forth and up and down until you could see your colleague on the next mountain and then you would say, I see the light. I'm going to light my torch on my mountain high up so people could see it. And similarly on the third mountain, and so on and so on. Okay, so then the Mishnah continues here in the Talmud and says, from which would they light the torches, which mountain? They start off in the Mount of Olives in Jerusalem itself, okay? And then these different place names, I apologize, I don't know where they are. But then this last one, Beit Baltin, would be the last, well, I guess the last official one, because it must have been by the border, because the idea is Israel, as you know, is not the largest country in the world, and maybe, in fact, they could transmit this message within Israel. But at the time, they knew that there were Jews living outside of Israel too, particularly to the east in Babylonia, actually to the west in Egypt as well. And so they had to pass this information along to the Jews living in the diaspora. And so after this last named mountain, or region that had a mountain, Beit Baltin, then they would wave the torch back and forth and up and down until they could see the entire diaspora before him like a bonfire. Okay, I'm assuming this is a bit of a exaggeration, but the idea is this is a kind of a method that they tried to use to convey this important message as to when Rosh Chodesh was going to be, again, not only to establish the importance of the kind of quasi-holiday status of Rosh Chodesh, but because everything else then would fall into place, because then you would know when all the other holidays were going to happen that month. So as I said, and I think I'm not going to really spend a lot of time on that, but this, as you can see, if this is the method of communication in ancient times, there's a chance there's not a heck of a lot of precision in it. And so it's probably around this time that Jews in diaspora countries started observing holidays on 2 days, right? We have the 2 days, the beginning of Pesach, for instance. Our fellow Jews in Israel only celebrate 1 day at the beginning of Pesach as their holy day of Pesach. And this is true with almost all the other holidays except for Yom Kippur, because no one's going to ask us to fast for 2 days. So, in case that the transmission was not precise and the day that you assumed was a holiday was not actually the holiday, or you're off by a bit, then you were given kind of a cushion by saying that Jews in the diaspora were now going to fulfill holidays on 2 days, just in case, plus or minus, they were off a little bit because of any kind of errors or inaccuracies with this type of transmission. So as I said, Israel still today still doesn't do that. They only keep the 1 biblical day of certain holidays that we keep 2 of. And of course, our Jewish Reform, in Reform Judaism, and I believe Reconstructionist Judaism also, have gone back to the biblical idea of only 1 of these days, rather 2, because they realize, guess what, we have calendars nowadays. We know with precision when a holiday is going to fall. So we might as well just keep the 1 day instead of 2. And of course, as far as I know, all conservative schools and Orthodox as well have kept the 2 days, mainly because of tradition. Okay, even though we also know with precision what date is what, we have a tradition for, probably 2,000 years to follow the holidays in this way, and so we continue to maintain them in that way. All right, let's see. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit more about the moon now. We're kind of switching gears from not talking about Rosh Chodesh, but talking about the moon in general. Excuse me. In order to do this, I wanted to share with you another idea, connected, although not exactly in line, but connected to what we were talking about. And this one is also from the Babylonian Talmud, from the tractate called Chulin on page 60, side B. And here is a further interpretation of one of the verses we saw from last time. As you well know, in Judaism, they say, actually it says in Pirkei Avot, hafoch ba v'hafoch ba dekula ba, which means you can turn it over and over and everything is in it, meaning the Torah, meaning, you could just have one interpretation, maybe the basic, and then another commentary, another commentary, another commentary, and learn so much from it. So this one is talking about, we had a problem or a challenge when we were talking about the creation of light last time, when we were talking about how is it that light could be created on day 1, but then the sun and the moon and stars aren't created until day 4. Where does that light come from? And we addressed that idea. Here we're looking at that same verse that talked about on day 4, and instead we're going to emphasize something different about it to learn something new. In this case, about the moon, right? Because that's really our focus for today. So in that verse, when it says God made the 2 great lights, I've highlighted them for you in yellow. And then the same verse continues and kind of gives more detail. The greater light to rule the day, and the lesser, with the light in here, light to rule the night. Okay, I've put some pictures in here for you. The big one is the sun, okay? The smaller one is the moon. Wait a minute, we were told they're both great. How can they both be great, and yet one is greater than the other? Again, math, that doesn't make sense. Or even in English grammar, it doesn't make sense. How can something be 2 great things, and then right away at the end of that same sentence, it says, oh, just kidding, one is great and one is lesser than great, except for it doesn't say the just kidding part. It just describes it that way. And so there are questions that the rabbis have in the Talmud as to what could that mean, and can we derive any significance from it? In this case, we have a kind of a fanciful interpretation where the moon is having a discussion with God. Now, can the moon talk? No, the moon can't talk. I know the moon can't talk, but we have all kinds of symbolic fables, or even sounds kind of almost mythological stories that are in by our rabbis as well in rabbinic literature. And they're there not just to entertain us, but to teach us lessons, either about life and morality, or as an opportunity, as a different style of commentary to help us understand biblical verses. And that's exactly what we have here. So the moon said before the Holy One, blessed be he, God, Master of the universe. God, you're the master of the universe. Is it possible for two kings to serve with one crown? Okay. This is really a fancy way of saying what I said before. Two things are great. Okay. How can, or it said, yeah, the two things are the great lights, but then you admitted afterwards that one was greater and one was lesser. So how does the first half of the sentence even make sense? Both things can't be great. There has to be, greatest, greater, great. They can't both be great. So how could they both be described in the same way? The first half of the sentence, where you're describing me, the moon, along with the sun, as being as great as the sun, just doesn't seem to make logical sense. God seems to agree with the moon and says, okay, fine. Go and diminish yourself. If you can't be the greatest with the sun, and one has to be greater, one has to be lesser. Thanks for pointing it out. Go ahead and become the lesser one, as it is in the second half of the verse. The moon said before him, Master of the universe, since I said a correct observation before you, must I diminish myself? He's like basically saying, God, I came and told you something was true, and now I'm getting punished for it. Like, it seems like the greater would be, the greatest. And now I'm this smaller thing. How come I'm the one that gets diminished or punished if I'm the one that pointed out to you? And there's another discussion between God and the moon that I actually left out here, ... And I brought it back to our idea of calendar, which is our focus, where it says here, God said to the moon, go, let the Jewish people count the days and years with you. Okay. Well, you might be small, moon, but you sure are important, because we need you and your cycles to tell the how the Jewish people to count the months, and therefore the days, the months, the years. And so it's all dependent on you. So don't worry, moon. You might be small, but you sure are important. Well, that moon was pretty darn smart. Because then it has counters to God. The moon said, but wait a minute. The sun will also be used for this as well, as it's impossible that they wouldn't count the seasons, as it says, and let them be for signs and for seasons and for days and for years. Also back in the creation story, talking about those great lights. Now we're talking about cycles in nature, right? And we talked about light and dark. We talked about cycles of the moon, but we didn't yet talk about equinox and other types of things that have to do with the sun, namely the seasons. Okay, so you might say, well, the seasons aren't important, but they are. And again, it ties us back to our upcoming holiday of Pesach. Okay, we have a verse here from Deuteronomy. I'm just watching the time. Oh, yikes. Okay. Observe the month of Aviv. Okay. Aviv means springtime in modern Hebrew. Actually, an ancient biblical name for the month of Nisan, the month of Pesach. And keep the Passover to the Lord thy God, for in the month of Aviv, the Lord thy God brought thee forth out of the land of Egypt by night. Okay. There are a lot of different commentaries about this. I've brought one from you for a rabbi named Sforno, who is from 15th century Italy. He's here to remind us that the month of Nisan always occurs in the spring. Okay, Pesach must happen in the spring. Okay, by manipulating the calendar if necessary, and we're going to say that you have to, and inserting an extra month of Adar. This is where we come to the idea of leap years in Judaism. By doing this, the solar orbit and the lunar orbit, okay, the solar orbit is the movement of the Earth around the sun, yes, and then the lunar orbit, like we said before, has to do with the revolution of the moon as it revolves around the Earth, that they are not equal to each other, but they need to be brought into line, okay? Since the 12-month lunar year is a few days shorter than a solar year, strictly following a lunar calendar would mean that the holidays would eventually take place at the wrong season. And if you follow the news or anything on social media nowadays, you see an example of that right now, because I'm fairly certain in the Muslim calendar, which is a lunar calendar, their holy month of Ramadan is happening now in the springtime. But there are some times that Ramadan happens in the summer or in the winter. It revolves through the seasons because it is a lunar calendar in Islam without a solar corrective. We have a solar corrective and we need a solar corrective because Pesach must always happen in the springtime. Here comes the math. Okay, the lunar year, which is 12 times 12 of the lunar cycles, remember 29.5 days, you get to this number, 354. A solar year, how the Earth moves around the sun, 365 days. The difference between them is 11 days, okay? And this 11 days is what would mess us up if we didn't correct with a leap year. It is so many days that a 1 day in 4 years, as we have with the secular year, leap year would not be enough. Instead, we have to add an entire month, okay? To solve this problem, Judaism coordinates the lunar year with the solar year, and therefore make sure the seasons happen during the right months, by a system of 19-year cycles in which there are 7 leap years, okay? And it does not fit any established pattern, just something you have to memorize or look it up. As a result, the Jewish holidays fluctuate by about a month or so in relationship to the non-Jewish calendar, but always fall in the same season. So if you remember last year, Pesach, most people were saying, oh, Pesach falls early this year, like it was still in March or whatever. This year is a leap year, which means we have a whole month, Adar Bey, which happens before the month of Nisan of Pesach. And that pushed us forward a little bit more to where we needed to be to ensure that Pesach is actually in the spring. It's last year, it was just before the spring, in early spring, so it was still technically okay. This year, later in the spring. That 19-year cycle is this. Every 3rd, 6th, 8th, 11th, 14th, 17th, and 19th year, you add that entire month of Adar Bet. And in fact, that's what we do this year. We are still in Adar Bet until this coming Shabbat, when we will be celebrating Rosh Chodesh Nisan. I think I will leave it there. Any questions? Math, science, calendars, Talmud, ideas for hopefully about the importance of time connecting to Pesach. Great ideas for your Pesach Seders. Maybe, hopefully.
Just a comment. I noticed that this year, I mean, this happens occasionally. It's Easter Friday is the first Seder, and Ramadan is just a few days off. And I don't know how often that happens, but it's
Right.
fascinating.
Yeah. Well, the of course, the Easter stuff, that's a whole other
Right.
history thing, right? In terms
Right.
of Pesach,
Yeah.
Good Friday, Easter Sunday, all
Yeah.
that stuff. And then you have to get into calendar reforms instituted by the popes in the Middle Ages also. So that's a whole different ballgame when it comes to history.
Okay.
I just have a comment.
Please.
It's Claudette.
Hi.
Hi. I just wanted to bring to mind someone, and may God rest his soul, Remy Landau. We had him in our synagogue, and he was so versed on the calendar. You know, he knew when a holiday would fall, even if it is 20, 30 years from now.
I have to tell you, there are people that I happen to be married to someone like that also, actually. I think there are some people's minds that just kind of work that way. It's very mathematical. And I think that some people just, they're naturals at it more than others. And it is wonderful to have one of them in the community to help things out before we could so easily access. Now, you can just type it into a computer and find out whatever you want. And but that's fairly recent. And before that, there still were a lot of calculations about things, especially having to do with the leap years, 1 or 2 days Rosh Chodesh. And I'm also amazed when people can do that, in their brains, do that kind of computation. It's like a gift, really, that some people have. So I'm happy you knew someone like that.
Anybody else? No.
Okay. Well,
I have one more.
Yeah,
I have a
please.
million. Because I
Go
find
for
this
it, Randy.
really fascinating. When they
Good.
announce Rosh Chodesh, they always announce Rosh Chodesh will be on such and such a day at such and such an hour and
Right.
so many halakim.
Team.
So
Right.
where's that?
Good. We got some good shul goers here. So halakim have to do with the portions of the halachic hour. So as I pointed out to you last time very quickly, because not really class in halacha, that this concept of 12-hour days exists in Judaism. But the 12 hours are not 12 hours of 60 minutes each. They are rather the entire amount of time of daylight during that day. And of course, that changes all the time. That divided into 12 portions. So when we're talking about the hour of the day from a halachic perspective, it's those many halachic hours. And if it's a part of that hour, it's not minutes, but it's rather pieces or portions of that halachic hour.
Okay. Thank you. I always wondered that. Anybody else?
I'm happy you asked.
Anybody else? Come on. Nobody else has any questions?
Okay, and it says here someone's looking for the YouTube posting, Anna, last time and this time. So is it up? Someone just asked that.
I will send the link to everybody for both weeks.
Wonderful.
I have to double check.
Okay.
Thank you.
Oh, well, I think the terms that I've used today, like Rosh Chodesh or, anything to do, like, I have a feeling that many of us, look, if you haven't heard any of these terms before, I'm happy you're here too, and I can introduce them to you. But I think that probably many of them you've heard before, and hopefully the idea is that I've brought them a little bit more into a cohesive whole, perhaps brought some more meaning to them, and also be able to show you the ancient sources where these ideas came from. And hopefully a little Pesach tie-in there, get your wheels moving in your head, if you like, in terms of any kind of conversation that you might have at your Passover Seders in terms of the importance of time and counting of time, coming together as a nation, coming together as a family. I could think of lots of ways you could go with that.
Okay.
If you're looking for a Friedvar Torah. And if you aren't, that's fine.
Annis, thank you so very, very much. We look forward to being with you again next week. And then there will be a bit of a break. So Anna and the rest of us can get ready for Pesach.
Right.
And recuperate from Pesach.
Yeah.
And then we'll get together again. But next week.
Watch your emails. I'll be doing that too to know when we're together next.
And you're getting lots of thank yous in the chat, Anna.
Thank you so much, everybody. Have a wonderful and very meaningful Pesach coming up, and I will see you after.
Take care.
Thanks for coming.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Chag Sameach, everyone.